It's Don here from the board. Thanks for coming along and checking out this video. Today's video is going to be a little bit different, but I'm going to be having a look at the FnCoder24. It's a PCB that's been developed and designed by a gentleman called Alex Fry. However, my look at this PCB is going to be a little bit different because it hasn't come from Alex and I haven't purchased it myself. Somebody from the local community actually reached out to me and asked if I could help them by desoldering their board because they wanted to upgrade it. So I said yes, and I'm just taking the opportunity to actually check out the board itself. But before I get into that, I've met Alex before and I didn't know very much about Alex, and now that I've gone to his website, I'm actually really awed by Alex. So this is not at all sponsored by anybody, but I do want to give a really big shout out to Alex for designing and developing this PCB and the fact that he has other projects as well. So this is Alex Fry's website, and he does compositing and color, and he has worked on some really big movies, which is absolutely amazing. If you go to the About page, you can see all of these films that he's actually done work on, which is actually really, really cool. But the cool part here is the FnCoder stuff, which is this thing. So this is the FnCoder24 that I've got here in my hand, but I never really fully understood why Alex wanted so many encoders, but now that I've seen the fact that he works in compositing and color space, that makes a lot of sense. And he's actually gone and designed the FnCoder84, which has 12 encoders on it instead of the standard F row, which I guess for whatever it is that he normally does and tweaks is very useful. So it's actually really, really cool. Now, what I've got here is not looking like this, but the owner of this PCB who asked me to help them out is going to turn it into something similar to this. So let's head down to the desktop and have a look. So here it is. This is the bare bone version of the FnCoder24. And you can see alexfry.com there. There it is on the back. FnCoder24. It's a Pro Micro driven device, and the person who has this has already put on the 4 encoders across the top, and they've put in T1 switches in it, I believe. Yeah, they feel like and look like T1s. So what they're doing project wise for this, come on focus, you can do better than that. The focus is not, there we go. Okay, so what's apparently happening to this once I actually desolder it for them is this will fit the CosPad case. So the switch is coming out, they're going to put in a plate, the plate will fit straight over the encoder, so I don't need to remove the encoders, and then they'll put the switches back through the plate and solder it to the PCB, and it should drop into the CosPad aluminium case. And the only other thing that they're asking me to do is they've actually cut off the Pro Micro, so they would like me to also remove the pins that's been left behind, and they'll put in a new Pro Micro in it. I don't really know what's happened to the original and why they ended up having to cut it off rather than desoldering that Pro Micro, but we'll try and see. So what I plan to do now is I'm going to desolder this in a time lapse, and then we'll come back and just have a look at the bare PCB in general. Now, originally, I was going to use this thing, right, which is the desoldering station that I've previously reviewed. However, because it's quite big and bulky and everything else, and it's a right royal pain to have to clean and whatnot, and because there's only a few switches in it, the secondary concern about using that gun because of the suction is trying to remove these pins, the Pro Micro headers. I was afraid that the suction might actually whip up the pins into the nozzle, and if that happens, that gun is going to be dead. So I'm going to hand pump desolder it with my trusty solder put and probably give myself some cramps on the thumb, but that's what we're going to do. Okay, so hopefully the next bit will just be a time lapse of me taking this thing apart, and then we'll come back and just have a look at the PCB overall in general, have a quick chat about it, and that should be a wrap. So let's zip to the next part where I take this apart. Okay, so we're back, and this is now completely desoldered for the switches and the pins. So you can see all the switches have come out now. I don't believe I've lifted any of the pads, and all of those Pro Micro pins have also been removed. Now I don't have any isopropyl, but you'll be able to clean up the flux of that pretty easily, and I don't think it's been too bad. Some of the actual pads were still, partially filled, so you may have noticed I went and refilled them and then I cleared them out fully to make it easier for when the owner wants to resolder this together. And because I don't need to actually touch those encoders for the plate to go on, since they'll just sit straight over the top, did not have to go and touch them at all. What I found really interesting on these switches was, and this is not a criticism of the individual who actually put this together in the first place, but this is just I suppose a service announcement for people who are building for the first time, right? From an experience point of view, I've put a lot of boards together, and I found some of these switches really hard to desolder and get out, and you would have seen that I was pulling on them and then touching them and moving them to break that little bit of joint, because often that joint has a really high surface tension on it and it doesn't want to come up with the sucker easily. And some of the issues that I found, and this is not from me desoldering it, is that some of the pins were already bent. And so, for example, if it'll focus, see that pin? That pin was actually bent flat against the pad, which made it really hard to desolder because the solder is actually getting around that pin and underneath it. So if you're putting a keyboard together, if you're putting a macro pad together, whatever it is, make sure you check your pins, right? The pin may not have been straight going in. It's hit at an angle from the insertion, it's bent it, so it's in that hook shape, but then it's made it through the hole and it stayed there. And these pins are really hard. They're quite stiff. So it's very unlikely that, and I hope, that when they were soldering, that they actually pushed it hard enough while soldering to bend it over. So most of the mechanical damage to pins is from insertion, and we see this more on hot swap situations where they're not straight up, they're not lining in properly, and you get bent or flattened pins, and or it actually pushes that hot swap socket out against the pad, rips the pads off the back of the PCB. So in this circumstance, it was a little bit of effort, and some of the other pins do have similar issues, and I don't think they're too bad. It's just something to be aware of. Now, I didn't want to straighten this simply because of the fact that, I didn't want to be responsible for potentially snapping the end off that. I'm just desolder it and they can, straighten it as they want, or it will go back through the pad, right? Like, because it came out of the pad like that. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, those pins on the Pro Micro bit, they came out pretty easily, so that was good. Not really an issue at all. They did go flying a little bit, but I caught them in the end. And once again, I refilled them so they had enough solder in there for the solder sucker to get a good clean pull out of the actual PCB. So now we can have a look at the actual PCB proper and its design and construction. So it's fairly standard having the diodes on the side. From a personal preference, and this is not a criticism of Alex and his design, is it niggles me personally that the diodes are not centered. That's a personal preference thing, and so the diode body is not centered to the actual switch and the hole. I understand that the alignment has been done so that the top of that SOD123 axial print is in line with that. I prefer to have mine slightly differently, but so that the actual diode body is in the center, and typically it's because I have mine on the other side. So that is less of an issue because then it actually lines up with the top pin. Okay. Some other really interesting things here is that the common row and column usage. So what I mean by that is the row is a series connector. Okay, so it goes down and it connects in series. And I suppose the issue for that is if something happens to the pad, if you burn that pad or lift it, then depending on where it is, it prevents all the other switches past that from the controller from working. And I guess that's just a preferential thing. So you'll see on the column, it's very similar in that it just goes from column, pin to column, pin to column, pin to column, pin. And you'll notice that that bottom one here doesn't go to anything else. So what happens here is if this top pad is damaged and it rips out that trace, all of these below will not work. So that is once again, it's a style thing. It's a preference thing. So now when I do mine, I actually have them go into a common trace and they branch off it rather than in a straight trunk. Once again, personal preference thing. I did find it really interesting that the Pro Micro was positioned quite low down rather than higher up. And I guess it doesn't technically matter. It's more that because there's no dedicated USB breakout on this, having the Pro Micro positioned down there with the socket position facing upwards, okay, because the actual footprint will show you the TX and the raw is at the top, your cable is actually running this way. It's actually running downwards into it. So let's just pretend this is a micro, because it's not, it's a mini, but the cable is doing this, right? So that's really interesting to do it that way because it's actually quite far in, but it's also because if you had it further up, it might have been impacted by the actual mount points here of the encoder. Now, of course, if you had turned the encoder the other way, you're still going to get these other contacts, but they all sit at the same height, so it's much the same. If you get a Pro Micro with the headers on it, depending on the orientation of how you mount it, if it's got enough height to clear it, then it wouldn't have mattered. You could have had that further up and it would sit there. So I don't know how that fits into the CosPad case, and I don't know where the actual cable entry is, and if that's going to be an impact or not, whether you will have to modify it or something like that, because if the CosPad and its XD24 PCB actually has an alignment for a USB port, then you kind of have to sort of work your way around that and then get it to connect into that position there. So that's just something to think about when you do a design on its compatibility. If it's not designed to necessarily utilize that. Maybe it is, I don't know, but that's just a thought that I was having when I was looking at this and pulling it apart. The other thing is, it looks like there's a lot of via points, and I don't really understand what's going on there. So if there's additional layers in this, rather than it just being a 2-layer PCB, what I mean by that is these pin holes. So typically they are part of vias, right? When you're going from one surface to the other surface or layer, and there's a whole bunch of them around, and I don't really know what is going on with them and where they're going, but without seeing the schematic, they may be another layer that's going on in here, but at the same time, you know, for example, one of them actually is nearly intersecting that trace there, which is really, yeah, which is really unusual. You know, and it is just going into blank space, right? It's just going into that lower of the left-hand one there, just in the middle of my fingernail. So, and that's not really going anywhere. That's not going to a pad. It's not. I don't know what those are or what they're doing. But in any case, it's fairly straightforward. It's very clean. The lines, you know, run to general guidelines. You know, verticals on one side, horizontals on the next, and it's quite sort of neatish going to the actual controller itself, with a lot of these lines getting in and around the two switches. I mean, it obviously works. So yeah, cool stuff. Getting a little bit compacted there, where you might have had options to put, you know, your diodes into different positions around that, but that's okay. That's just an aesthetics thing, and yeah, cool. So that's the FnCoder24. It's a numpad that supports 4 rotary encoders. If that is the kind of thing that you are interested in and think would help you, and supposedly it will fit into a CosPad case, then go have a chat to Alex Fry and get hold of one of these to help your activities along. So thank you very much to the local person for, you know, reaching out to me to help them put this, to take this apart, not put this together, to take it apart. A little bit unusual for me generally, because most of the time people are asking me to build stuff, not to unbuild stuff. So hopefully they'll have lots of fun putting this back together and getting it running in a brand new case. And of course, thank you to Alex for creating and designing this to provide more options out to the community when they want more encoders. Cool. Right, that's it. Thank you very much for checking out this video. I hope you liked that. And of course, you know, leave your comments in below, especially about my bad desoldering techniques. If you like this kind of stuff, hit that like button. If you're not subscribed and you want to, you know, support me here on this channel, please hit that subscribe button. And of course the bell notifications if you want YouTube to alert you when another video comes out. Well, thank you again for coming along and checking out this video. And of course, as usual, until next time, happy clacking.